this video, you're watching the third lesson on body systems. This lesson will talk about the digestive system. So, the digestive system is integrally linked to all the other systems because of its main purpose. The purpose of the digestive system is to provide energy, or well, not to provide energy, but to get energy from the food we eat, right? The digestive system is designed to get energy from the food we eat. So when we eat an apple, when we eat a steak, when we eat a hamburger, that food has energy in it. And for us to survive, and again in our video on muscles, to move, we need energy to survive and move and do the things we do every day. Well, we need to get that energy from somewhere. Unfortunately, we're not like plants. Plants make their own food and then they consume it to get energy. Well, we don't have that ability to make our own food, so we have to eat it, we have to consume it. But the way the food is before we eat it, an apple, a hamburger, a steak, the way it is at that moment, well, it's not easy to get that energy, right? You can't just like get the energy out of it, you can't pull it out. You have to go through a process. And your digestive system has evolved to develop that process so that we can get energy from the food we eat. So again, the digestive system's purpose is to get energy from the food we eat. So where do we begin? Well, as with food, we begin with the mouth, right? When we put food in our mouth, our teeth right here, these look like beaver teeth from the side, but our teeth right here, right? Well, their job is to break food down into smaller pieces, right? You're not going to shove a hamburger in your mouth and just begin to swallow. You will choke and possibly die. So your teeth chew up your food. They break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. In addition, your saliva, or commonly known as spit, well, it also has stuff in it. These things are called proteins, and these proteins are there so that you can break the food down even further. So if you were to put a cracker in your mouth and just let it sit without even chewing on it, your spit would start to break the cracker down into smaller and smaller pieces until it becomes a paste mixed in with your spit. It becomes basically pasty rather than a solid cracker, right? Your spit has proteins in it, and the scientific name is salivary amylase. You don't need to know that, but for your knowledge, your spit is able to break down the food you eat. When you put food in your mouth, your spit is immediately starting to break it down. And as you chew, you're breaking it down even further. And so when you chew something, you make it smaller, which makes it easier for your spit to break it down even further, which gets broken down even further as you chew in the spit, and everything's mixing together. And so now you have this nice mixture of food and spit. Delicious. And so at that point, the food is ready to be swallowed. And when you swallow your food, your tongue pushes the food back down into an organ called the esophagus. And the esophagus' main job is just to easily transport food from your mouth down into the stomach. Now it does this using smooth muscles. Oh, there we go. We're connecting it to another organ system. So your smooth muscles line your esophagus, and they sort of wiggle and move and push that food all the way down into your stomach, right? So food gets chewed up by your teeth, broken down by your spit, and then swallowed and brought down through your esophagus into your stomach. Your stomach, well, when the food hits your stomach, it begins secreting or releasing a chemical called hydrochloric acid, HCl for short. And so this HCl, just like our spit, but stronger, begins breaking down our food, begins breaking it down even further. So our teeth break it down, our spit breaks it down, our stomach acid breaks it down. And your stomach is also lined with smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle shakes and moves that acid and that food around, making it easier for your acid to break down your food. It makes it easier for your body, your stomach, and the acid to break that food even down into smaller pieces. So again, You chew it up, gets smaller. Your spit breaks it down even further. You swallow it, it goes down your esophagus, into your stomach, and your stomach releases acid, and that acid, along with the shaking of your stomach, well, the movement of your stomach, makes the food break down even more. Right? We're breaking that food down even more. So we have all this breaking down, right? So far, our teeth break things down, our spit breaks things down, and our stomach acid breaks things down into smaller and smaller pieces. Why are all these steps revolving around breaking things down? Well, the purpose is that the food needs to be small enough for our cells, as we talked about, all life is made up of cells, and we are made up of many, many, many cells. Well, for our cells to absorb the food, to absorb the nutrients, to absorb the energy, it needs to be broken down into incredibly small parts. So when we eat a burger, the burger doesn't just go into our cells, right? It needs to be chewed, it needs to be spat on, it needs to be broken down, it needs to fall into our stomach and melted by the acid, and then a little bit more, and then it's small enough, the parts, the nutrients, and the energy have been spread out and separated enough so that our bodies can now absorb it into ourselves. Well, how do we do that? Well, we got something called the small intestine. Now, unfortunately, the small intestine isn't small, right? It's actually much, much larger than its counterpart, the large intestine. Because the small intestine's job is to absorb the nutrients in food, to absorb the good stuff in the food, to get that energy from the burger, to get that energy from the steak, right? Your small intestines absorb the energy or the nutrients from the food. And that's its job. So the small intestines have these little fingers. I know that's a terrible way to describe them, but they have these little fingers on the inside. And these small fingers are called villi. And if you want to get even more technical, they have little tiny fingers on their fingers called microvilli. And so what they do is they allow the small intestines to absorb the food into our blood, right? Our nutrients get absorbed. The nutrients from this food we ate get absorbed from the small intestine to the blood via the villi, right? And the reason why our small intestines have these little fingers is because we want more surface area. We want more parts of our intestines touching the food and nutrients. So if, for example, if we had a tube that represented our small intestines, the food would just travel through here and only get absorbed along the walls, right? But if we had a small intestine like this, and they had these wavy parts, now this is a terrible drawing, but these wavy parts which represent our villi, the food traveling through is touching more of the small intestine. So we can absorb it much easier. We can absorb it much easier. So that's why we have these villi, these small finger projections that allow the small intestine to absorb the nutrients into the blood. So the small intestines gets help though, because not every nutrient is easily absorbed. Not every nutrient is easily absorbed. And so what happens is it gets a bit of help from other organs. It gets a bit of help from other organs. And so how it does this is it uses the liver and the pancreas to help it absorb nutrients. So we have the liver, this big guy right here, and the pancreas, this shape right here, right? And in the middle we got the bile duct and the gallbladder. Well, what happens is the small intestine gets help through the liver and pancreas because they add proteins called enzymes into the intestines, right? So when food hits our small intestines, the pancreas, so this would be the small intestine right here, the pancreas releases some enzymes, and the liver, via the bile duct, releases some other chemicals as well. And these chemicals help the small intestines break food down more and also allow us to absorb certain nutrients. So we'll talk about the liver. The liver is very large, and it has a lot of jobs. One of them is to make something called bile. Now, bile is this sort of yellowish green thing that if you've ever vomited on an empty stomach, you would see this green color of liquid, this greenish yellow liquid. That's bile. It doesn't taste so good. And what this does is that bile mixes with fat in our food and makes it easy to absorb. Fat is made out of oil, right? And we're mostly water. And as we talked about in Mix and Flow, water and oil do not mix. So bile from the gallbladder releases into our small intestine. And so our small intestine now has this bile, and this bile sort of makes the fat easy to absorb. It allows you to absorb the oil, which is fat. And so the liver will make bile, and it's stored in the gallbladder, and the gallbladder will then, when it's ready, release that bile into our small intestine. And so we need the liver to make bile so that we can absorb fats, right? So this allows our body to absorb fats. The liver is a fascinating organ. It also filters the blood. It also can regenerate. If you were to cut off 60% of the liver, it will just grow back. I don't think there's any other organ that can do that. And so the liver is the largest organ with a lot of jobs. And one of its jobs for the digestive system is to make bile. And bile makes fat absorbable in our body. We also have the pancreas. The pancreas, this sort of brain-looking thing, makes a lot of proteins and a lot of enzymes. And one of them helps us absorb sugar. Right? And the protein that it makes is called insulin. So you've probably heard of the disease diabetes. And diabetes is usually caused by a lack of insulin, right? So the person's body is not making insulin, and so they can't absorb sugar. And if they can't absorb sugar, then their body doesn't have that resource available to them in order to give themselves energy, because sugar is so full of energy. So the pancreas creates many proteins, and one of them is called insulin, and you should know what insulin is. Insulin allows our body to absorb sugar. Insulin allows our body to absorb sugar, and insulin is made from the pancreas. Large intestines. Again, the large intestine is smaller than the small intestine. It's just wider, right? It looks fatter. And its job is to absorb all the water that's left, right? We spat all over our food, and our small intestine's filled with water, and the stomach acid has water in it, and it goes through our small intestines. Well, after we absorb the nutrients, we want to absorb the water. And so our large intestines, like this, allows us to absorb the water. So that we don't dehydrate when we eat. That would be terrible. So our body has this large intestine to absorb the water left. So once you've absorbed all the nutrients, once you've taken all the water out, well then what you have left is everything you can't digest, everything you can't break down, everything you don't want to absorb, right? And that's called poo, or feces. And that's called poo. And so our body goes with the burger in our hands, we eat the burger, we chew it up, our teeth breaks it down. Our saliva, our spit, breaks it down even more because the spit has proteins in it. We swallow it, it goes down our esophagus, hits our stomach. In our stomach makes acid, hydrochloric acid. And our stomach sort of shakes and rumbles and mixes that acid with the food, and it breaks it down even further. And the reason why we chew our food and spit all over our food and have acid in our stomach is because we need to break the food down so small that the cells in our body can absorb it. And it's absorbed in the small intestine. And the small intestine have these little fingers called villi. And the villi absorb the nutrients into our blood, right? And we'll talk about what the blood does with that. But the small intestine absorb the nutrients via the villi, and that goes in our blood. And the small intestines get help from our liver and pancreas. The liver and pancreas make enzymes and chemicals that help us break down or absorb foods or nutrients, such as fats. The liver makes bile. Bile lets our body absorb fats because, again, we are mostly water. And so, for the fat to mix in with our body into our bloodstream, it needs bile to make it easier to absorb. The pancreas makes insulin, and insulin allows your body to store sugars. And if we can't store sugars, that's called diabetes, right? Sugar is one of the main sources of energy in our body. And if we can't store it, if we can't hold on to it, then that's a bad thing because our body lacks that storage ability to hold on to energy after we've eaten it. And once you've absorbed all that energy, all that nutrients, well, there's water left. Well, our large intestine absorbs that water. Our large intestine sucks out all that water. And what's left is everything you can't digest, everything you can't break down. And that's poo. And poo, well, after it's gone through the small intestine and all the resources and all the water has been absorbed, it enters something called the rectum. And the rectum holds on to your poo, and the anus is the exit hole by which poo leaves. That's it. That's our digestive system. That's how it goes from our mouth to poop. Food in our mouth to poop out our backside. So this will review all the parts. Hopefully this was useful. We'll be talking about other systems in the next lesson.